Look at that child's eyes, Emmett. Look at her and tell me you don't know your own blood when it's standing in front of you.
Nobody in Caldwell ever asked Clara Holt to leave. They just made it so she had nowhere to stand. No invitation to the Women's Charitable Society. No seat saved at the church social. Nods in the street when they came at all, the kind a person gives to something they would rather not look at too long. The town hadn't decided she was wicked. It had decided she was inconvenient. And inconvenient things, in a cattle boomtown still arguing about whether it deserved a proper church, had a way of disappearing without anyone needing to say a single word. Clara had not disappeared. She lived in a narrow clapboard house at the south edge of town, on a quarter-acre her sister Dora had pressed on her 3 years ago with an expression that managed to be both generous and a reminder of what had made the generosity necessary. The house needed paint. The fence needed 2 new posts. The roof had a shingle above the east window that caught the wind wrong and lifted every time a storm came through. Clara had no money for paint, no time for fence posts, and no one to ask about the shingle. So she wedged the folded corner of a flour sack under it each autumn and hoped for a mild winter. She was in the yard hanging Nettie's dress on the line when Emmett Vane first stopped his horse at her fence. He didn't introduce himself. She knew who he was. Everyone in Caldwell knew the Double V spread, which sat 3 miles east of town and ran 300 head, going on 400 after the summer drive. She had seen him at church before she stopped attending, seen him at the dry goods counter at the livestock auction. A broad-shouldered man in a dark coat who moved through Caldwell with the unhurried quality of someone who carried no debts and owed no one an explanation. He looked at her roof. He looked at the shingle. "That'll go in the first hard wind," he said. "I know it," Clara said. She did not turn from the clothesline. He sat on his horse a moment longer. Then he rode on. She watched him go. Nettie, standing in the grass with both hands wrapped around a fence slat, watched him too. The child had never shown particular interest in strangers. She watched Emmett Vane until he cleared the bend in the south road and the dust settled behind him. He came back the following Tuesday with a hammer and a cloth sack of roofing nails. Clara was at the fence when he dismounted. She rested her hand on the gate latch, not blocking him, just present. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "No," he said, "you didn't." He waited. Clara looked at him the way she had learned to look at men who came to her fence, measuring the kind of attention they were carrying and what they expected in return for it. He held her gaze without shifting his weight or changing his expression. There was nothing in his face that required anything from her. She opened the gate. He fixed the shingle in 20 minutes. She stood in the yard with Nettie on her hip and watched him work. Up the ladder, 3 nails, back down. And when he descended, she had a cup of water waiting, which was common decency and nothing more, and she told herself that was all it was. He thanked her for the water. He asked the girl's name. "Nettie," Clara said. He nodded at the child. Nettie studied him with the absolute frankness of a 3-year-old and then pressed her face into her mother's shoulder. Emmett smiled, briefly, one side of his mouth, and picked up his hammer. "She'll do," he said. Clara understood it was a compliment. It was also one of the few things anyone had said about Nettie in 3 years that didn't carry a weight underneath it, and she stood with that for a moment after he walked to his horse and untied the reins. He left without lingering. Across the road and 40 yards north, behind the window glass of the Holt General Store, Dora Holt had been watching since the moment Emmett Vane tied his horse to Clara's fence. She watched him go up the ladder. She watched Clara hand in the water. She watched him ride away. By the time the Women's Charitable Society met 3 days later in the back room of the First Church, The story had acquired details, some accurate, some not, and it moved around the room with the low, continuous urgency of a fire that has just found a dry wall. Harlan Holt heard it from behind his counter when two of the women stopped in for cotton thread on their way home. He was marking inventory in his ledger, his pen moving in its careful columns. He did not look up. He let them talk. The story took about 4 minutes to tell, and when they left, the bell above the door settling back to silence, he set his pen down. He stood at the window and looked south toward Clara's roofline, which no longer had a lifting shingle. His face held a stillness that had very little to do with calm. Emmett came back the following week with a length of new fence post and a post hole digger across his saddle. Clara was on the porch shelling beans when he rode up, Nettie asleep inside. She watched him tie his horse and unload the post without opening the gate. "You don't have to keep coming," she said. "I know it," he said. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. She went back to her beans and listened to him work, the deliberate sounds of a man with a specific task and no particular hurry about it. Most men who had come to her fence in the years before she learned to discourage them had talked constantly about themselves, about the territory, about their acreage and their ambitions, and what they intended to build before another winter came through. Emmett Vane worked in a silence that felt less like restraint than like a man who had already settled, some time ago, the question of who he was. When he finished, he stood at the gate. "I'd like to call again," he said, "if that's agreeable." Clara set her bowl on the step. She looked at him in the flat afternoon light, the smell of dried grass and cooling air between them. "Mr. Vane," she said, "I want you to understand what calling on me will cost you in this town. I expect I have some idea." "I don't think you do." Not unkindly, just a statement of fact from a woman who had 3 years of evidence. He looked at her steadily. "Then I'll find out," he said. She did not tell him yes. She did not tell him no. She picked up her bowl and went back to the porch, and he untied his horse and rode east toward the double V, and Clara sat in the last of the afternoon light and did not watch him go, which required a deliberate and specific effort that she immediately decided not to examine. That evening, Harlan Holt rode out to the double V. Emmett answered the door himself. He brought the man inside, offered the chair by the stove, and made coffee with the methodical patience of someone who was not surprised by the visit and had no intention of hurrying it along. Harlan sat with his hat on his knee and his scriptures under his arm. He spoke about community, about standards that protected families, about the particular difficulty of building a decent town at the end of a cattle trail, where the line between what was acceptable and what was not required constant tending. He spoke about young women who had made choices and the natural weight of those choices, and about a man of standing who might, without intending any harm, disturb arrangements that had taken years to reach their present shape. He spoke for 11 minutes. Emmett did not interrupt once. Then Harlan said, "There are things about that woman you don't know, Emmett. Things a man in your position would want to know before he made himself conspicuous." Emmett poured a second cup of coffee. He set it in front of Harlan. He straightened and put both hands in his coat pockets. "I appreciate you riding out," he said. Harlan looked up. "I'll show you out," Emmett said. He stood at the door until Harlan's horse disappeared into the dark. The night was cool and smelled of dried grass and the first suggestion of frost on the air. Somewhere east, a coyote called once and went quiet. Emmett stood in the doorway a moment longer, then went inside and banked the stove. He did not sleep quickly that night, but if any name turned over in his mind in the dark, there was no one there to see it. Emmett was at his kitchen table before first light, turning a tin cup in both hands, watching the orange glow of the stove through the iron grate. The coffee had gone cold, he hadn't noticed. He had been sitting with the same question since Harlan's horse disappeared into the dark. Not whether he intended to continue calling on Clara, which was already settled somewhere below the level of conscious decision, but what it meant that Harlan had ridden 3 miles on a Tuesday evening. A deacon didn't make that ride for pastoral reasons. A deacon made it because something threatened his arrangements, and arrangements, in Emmett's experience, were always about something the man was unwilling to name out loud. He got up before sunrise and rode into Caldwell as the town was beginning to stir. Smoke from the first cook fires, a dog moving along the alley behind the general store, the sky the pale grey-pink of cold autumn mornings on the Kansas plain. On a Wednesday, he brought Nettie a horse. He had carved it from a cedar plank on 2 evenings when the wind kept him inside. Rough-hewn, the legs too thick, the muzzle too blunt, but he had taken some care with the mane and cut a groove down the neck where a small finger could sit comfortably. He tied it with a short length of leather cord and left it on Clara's fence post before she was up. He was still on his horse when Nettie came out of the house and found it. She held it at arm's length. She examined it from all sides with the gravity of a judge assessing evidence. Then she tucked it under one arm, looked up at Emmett on his horse, and gave him the expression of a child who has received exactly what she required. She named it immediately. She called it Mud. Clara appeared in the doorway laughing, a real laugh, startled out of her, the unself-conscious kind she had apparently stopped spending freely. Emmett sat on his horse in the October sunlight and accepted Nettie's solemn presentation of Mud for his inspection with the full seriousness the occasion warranted. "She'll name anything," Clara said from the doorway. "Mud's a fine name for a horse," Emmett said. "I've known horses with worse." He dismounted. He sat on the stump near the fence while Nettie demonstrated Mud's various capabilities against the post rail. Clara brought 2 cups of coffee and sat on the porch step. The morning was cool and smelled of wood smoke and late-season grass going dry. They didn't talk much. It was a specific quality of silence, not the absence of something, but the presence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the air between them. He looked at her once across the yard while Nettie was occupied, and Clara was already looking at him, and neither of them remarked on it. The letter came from Ben Aldrich the following week. A rider delivered it to the Double V on a Tuesday morning. The fall cattle deal had shaped up different. Sorry for the inconvenience. Emmett saddled up and rode into town. He found Aldrich at the saloon at midday, nursing a whiskey he was giving more attention than it deserved. The man looked up when Emmett came through the door and then looked at his glass. "Ben," Emmett said. Aldrich turned his glass on the bar top. "Nothing personal," he said quietly. "Business just shaped up different, like I wrote." "You wrote that." Emmett settled onto the stool beside him. "Tell me what shaped it." Aldrich was quiet for a while. The barkeep moved to the far end and found something to polish. Then, "Harlan had a word with me." Emmett nodded once. $600 worth of cattle, handled with a word over a counter. "I see," he said. "I'm sorry, Emmett." Aldrich finally looked at him, and there was something genuine in it, which only made it worse. "Man's got reach in this town. Always has." Emmett put a coin on the bar. He stood. He didn't tell Aldrich what he thought of him. It would have been easy and accurate and entirely beside the point. He walked back out into the raw morning, stood in the mud of Caldwell's main street, and looked north toward the church steeple and the Holt store sign hanging below it. Then he turned and rode south. Clara was bringing in the laundry when he arrived, and something in the set of his jaw told her before he spoke. "He went to your buyer," she said. Not a question. Emmett came through the gate. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. "Stop coming here," she said. She kept her voice level. "Not because I want you to. I need you to understand the difference. But I have watched this town work for 3 years. I know what it does to what it has decided to discard, and I can survive being discarded. I have survived it. But I will not be the reason it turns on a man who doesn't deserve it. Can I ask you something? He said. She waited. Do you want me to stop coming? That's not the question. It's the only one I'm asking. Clara stood with the sheet in her arms and looked at him in the flat October light. The same look as the first day, measuring, reading, except now she already knew the answer and was deciding whether she was willing to say it out loud to a man standing in her yard with his hat in both hands. No, she said. He nodded once. He took the other end of the sheet and helped her fold it, and they worked down the line in silence, and that was all either of them said about it. 3 days after that, Dora came to Clara's door alone, which was a signal in itself, because Dora never came alone anymore. She came in and sat at the table and looked at her hands. She did not say what she had come to say. 10 minutes later, Harlan arrived, as if by coincidence. He settled into Clara's only good chair without being invited. He spoke plainly, in the measured tone of a man who considered plainness a virtue and cruelty a waste of good effort. He said that Emmett Vane was a man of standing who would eventually tire of the particular inconvenience Clara represented. Men like that always did, and when that happened, her position in Caldwell would be considerably worse than it was now. The town would have watched her reach above herself and fail. He said Dora worried for her. He said he did too, in his way. He folded his hands in his lap. Clara stood at the window with her back to him for the full duration. When he finished, she said, "I'd like you both to leave now." Dora touched her sister's arm on the way past. Clara stood very still and did not move. She listened to the wagon until the sound of it crossed the north bend and went quiet. Then she sat down on the floor against the wall with her knees drawn up, and she stayed there until Nettie woke from her nap and came padding out in her stockings looking for her. Harlan found Emmett at the livery stable on a Thursday evening, neutral ground, which was deliberate. He stood in the barn doorway while Emmett worked a brush along his mare's shoulder, and he said he wanted to tell him something that a man of Emmett's character would want to know. Emmett kept brushing. "The man who put Clara Holt in the position she's in," Harlan said, "is not someone you would want to stand beside her to defend, not when you know who it is." The brush slowed. "His name," Emmett said. Harlan was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man savouring a card he has no intention of playing yet. "There'll be a time for that," he said. "I wanted to give you the chance to step back with your dignity before that time comes. Because it will come. Publicly, if it needs to." Emmett set the brush on the stall rail. He turned and looked at Harlan Holt in the barn doorway, the failing light at his back, the scripture under his arm, the face of a man who had constructed a complete justification for himself and lived inside it comfortably. "You come tell me the name," Emmett said, "when you're ready to say it, where people can hear you." Harlan left without another word. The mare shifted her weight. Emmett picked up the brush and finished the job, his hands moving steadily along her flank, and in his mind he was running arithmetic, a dead man's calendar, a child's age, the dark, familiar eyes he'd been looking at for weeks, and the numbers were coming up the same way every time he ran them. He stood motionless for a long moment with his hand against the horse's side. Then he finished. The Sunday arrived the way reckoning does in small towns, announced by nothing in particular, yet felt in advance by everyone who had been paying attention. 2 days of rain had turned Caldwell's main street to grey paste. The sky was low and moving. Emmett arrived at Clara's door at 8:30, and she was already dressed in her good clothes, Nettie on her hip, a shawl over her shoulders against the cold. She had understood what this morning was before he said a word. They walked together down the main street toward the first church. Every window they passed held a face behind the glass. No one called out. No one said good morning. They just watched. The particular watching of people who have already made their decision and are waiting for the moment to declare it out loud. The crowd had assembled on the church steps by the time Emmett and Clara arrived. 8 people, then 12, then 20, drawn by some communication that had moved through Caldwell's back rooms without leaving a trace. Clara Holt stood at the center in his good black coat, his scripture under one arm, one hand resting on the church fence post, with the patience of a man who has chosen his ground carefully and arrived early. The crowd shifted to let the two of them be seen. "This needs to stop here," Harlan said. "Today." Above the church steeple, the sky had gone the color of a rifle barrel. Caldwell was watching. The crowd made a sound. Not quite voices, more the collective breath of 20 people who have privately committed to a public act and are now waiting on each other to begin it. Mud pulled at their boots. The church bell had gone quiet. Nettie was on Clara's hip, with Mud, the wooden horse, tucked under her chin, her eyes moving across the gathered faces with the frank curiosity of a child who does not yet know what a crowd assembled against her looks like. Harlan stepped down from the church steps and addressed the assembled town as much as the 2 people standing in front of him. He spoke about the foundations of a Christian community and what those foundations required of its leading men. He spoke about the standards that protected families, and particularly the children who had entered the world without the shelter of a father's name. He deployed scripture with a pastor's fluency, not as a weapon, which would have been too obvious, but as a verdict already handed down from somewhere above the present conversation, requiring only announcement. He spoke about Emmett's standing, about what Caldwell needed from the men who shaped it, about the cattle trade and civic responsibility, and what the children of this town learned from watching what their elders decided was acceptable. He spoke for 12 minutes. Emmett stood without moving through all of it, weight even on both feet, dark coat buttoned against the cold, hat level, face giving away nothing that he hadn't decided to give. Beside him, Clara had heard versions of this speech for 3 years. She had heard it in silences and in waiting rooms, in the careful charity of women who meant well and the precise management of men who did not. She had heard it until some part of her had almost come to believe it. She did not believe it today, not with Emmett Vane's arm solid against hers and not going anywhere. When Harlan finished, the crowd settled into the satisfied quiet of a verdict expected to hold. Then Harlan opened his scripture to no particular page, held it a moment, and closed it again. "I want to say one more thing," he said. "Out of respect for this man, and I do respect him, I want him to hear what I am about to say before he makes a choice he cannot walk back from." He looked at Emmett. "The man who fathered that child," Harlan said, "was Cale Vane." The crowd went still. "Your brother," Harlan said, with the deliberate patience of a man who wants the information to land completely. "Came through Caldwell close on 4 years ago on his way back from Wichita. Stayed 2 weeks. Left without a word to anyone, and dead of a fever 6 months after. Clara was 20 years old." He paused. Let the silence do its work. "Look at that child's eyes, Emmett. Look at her, and tell me you don't know your own blood when it's standing in front of you." Every face in the crowd turned to Emmett Vane. The silence had weight. It pressed down across the mud and the church steps and the grey moving sky. Harlan stood with his scripture at his side and his chin slightly raised, the posture of a man who has just played the last card from a hand 3 years in the building and is waiting to collect everything the table holds. Emmett looked at the ground. 1 moment, no more. Then he looked at Nettie. The child was watching him with her head tilted, Mud, the wooden horse, pressed against her chin, her eyes, heavy-lidded, wide-set, dark in a way that had been nagging at the edge of Emmett's recognition since the first week he'd stood in Clara's yard. Fixed on his face with the complete open attention of a child who has not yet learned to look away from hard things. They were Cale's eyes. They were his mother's eyes. They were Vane eyes, going back further than either brother had lived to count. Emmett stood inside that knowledge and did not try to move around it. He let it be exactly what it was. His brother's carelessness, a young woman's 3 years of survival, a child who had named a cedar horse Mud and carried it everywhere she went. He took the full measure of it, and when he had, something in his face went very quiet and very clear, the way a man looks when he has stopped deciding and simply knows. He turned to Clara. She was already braced. He could see it in the set of her jaw and the way she held Nettie fractionally tighter. Braced for the withdrawal, for the step backward, for the expression a man wears when the true cost of something finally arrives and turns out to be more than he had advertised to himself that he was willing to pay. She had been waiting for that expression since the morning he fixed her roof. Some part of her had kept one eye on the door every day since. Emmett reached out and took her hand. He turned to face Clara Holt and the assembled town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the mud and the cold of a Sunday morning in 1878, and he said, "I know." 2 words, normal volume, meaning several things at once, and meaning all of them completely. He had not flinched. He had not let go of her hand. The crowd stirred. Harlan's chin came down a fraction. He had built this morning with architecture, the scripture, the crowd, the public nature of it, the name delivered where everyone could see what it did to Emmett Vane. Every part of the calculation had been exact. Every part of the calculation was wrong. "Emmett," Harlan began. "We're done," Emmett said, not loudly, the way a man ends a conversation that ran past its useful length some time ago. He looked out at the crowd. Not in defiance, nothing theatrical in it, no performance of righteousness to match Harlan's own. Just a man acknowledging the people around him with the same steady directness he had brought to every other thing since Harlan first knocked on his door. Several of the faces looked away. Then he walked Clara and Nettie away from the church steps, through the crowd, which parted because there was nothing else to do, and back down Caldwell's main street through the grey morning mud. At the edge of the crowd, Clara Holt took one step forward. Harlan turned. He reached for her arm. She pulled it away, not violently, with the quiet finality of a woman who has been approaching a decision for years and has just arrived at it. She did not cross the street to her sister. The distance was too great, the years between them too complicated for a single morning to bridge. But she did not go back to stand beside her husband. She stood where she was, alone in the thinning crowd, and Harlan looked at her with the expression of a man who understands, for the first time, that the instrument he has spent years sharpening has just turned in his hand. He said her name, low and controlled, the way he said everything. She looked at him the way a person looks at something that has just shown them its true dimensions after presenting itself as something smaller for a very long time. She walked home alone. The justice of the peace who married them was a circuit judge named Abernethy, who came through Caldwell every 6 weeks on a route covering 4 counties and 2 territories. He was a tired man with good handwriting and no particular opinions about weather or ceremony. He performed the service on a cold Thursday morning in November in the parlour of a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who had offered the room because she was 81 years old, answerable to no one, and had decided she liked Emmett Vane on the occasion of meeting him at the dry goods counter 2 years prior. The parlour smelled of tallow candles and dried lavender and the cedar chest in the corner. Through the window, the Kansas plain ran flat and iron grey to the horizon. The wind came off it hard enough to rattle the glass in the casement. Clara had finished the dress at midnight. Dark blue wool, simple, the hem straight and level, the seams pressed. She wore her mother's garnet pin at the collar. Emmett wore his good jacket, which smelled of cedar and pressed wool and the faint, honest residue of horses and work. Nettie was on Clara's hip, in her white dress with the grass stain on the knee that no amount of scrubbing had fully removed. Mud, the cedar horse, held in one fist. Judge Abernethy read the words in his practiced, unhurried cadence. Mrs. Pratt stood at the window with her hands folded, her expression one of composed satisfaction. Across town, the first church bell began tolling the hour. Nobody in the parlour counted it. When the judge reached the place where Clara needed to sign the register, she shifted Nettie to her other hip and reached for the pen. Emmett stepped forward without being asked and took the child from her, settled Nettie against his shoulder with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who had been thinking about doing exactly this for some time. Nettie, half asleep against the warmth of his coat, curled against him without protest. Mud the horse hung from her loose fist. Clara signed her name. The judge blotted it. The pen went back in its holder. The bell rang 5 times and stopped. Nobody in the parlour counted. Emmett had one hand flat under Nettie's back and one hand pressed against the register beside his wife's signature, and he was looking at neither the door, nor the window, nor the church whose bell had gone quiet across town. He was looking at Clara. She was already looking back. Outside, the Kansas plain ran on without remark, the way it always had and would, wide and cold and indifferent to the arrangements of the small towns that had staked themselves temporarily at its edge. It had seen harder things than this. It would see harder things again. But in a widow's borrowed parlour, on a cold November morning, with a child asleep against a man's shoulder and a woman reading her new name in the clerk's ledger, the plain was only weather and distance. Emmett pulled Nettie a little closer. He waited for his wife to finish. Some things in a cattle town, it turned out, could not be shaped by the right men having the right word with the right man at the right time. Some things, once they took root in honest ground, just grew. There are people in this story I keep coming back to. Not Harlan, who believed every word he said, and not the crowd, who were only afraid of what they might have to admit if Clara was allowed to be ordinary. The one I keep coming back to is Nettie, 3 years old with a carved horse named Mud, and her father's eyes, handed to a man who could have refused to count her and didn't. If this story stayed with you, pass it somewhere it might land on someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to know what this channel has waiting next, stay close.